Imagine for a moment that you could travel back in time, not to see dinosaurs or witness the birth of civilization, but to visit Earth 900,000 years ago. You're expecting to find our ancestors scattered across Africa, living their lives, hunting, gathering, surviving. But when you arrive, something's terribly wrong. You search for days, weeks, months. You comb through forests and grasslands, check cave systems and river valleys, and what you find is horrifying. There are barely any humans left. Not thousands, not tens of thousands, just 1,280 breeding individuals clinging to existence on the entire planet. That's fewer people than attend most high school football games, fewer than live in a single apartment building in any major city. The entire future of humanity, everything we would ever become, compressed into a group so small they could all fit inside a modern shopping mall. This isn't science fiction. This actually happened. And nobody knew about it until 2023. Today, over 8 billion humans dominate every corner of Earth. We've conquered mountains, crossed oceans, even walked on the moon. We're the most successful large animal on the planet. But 900,000 years ago, we were on the absolute edge of extinction. One bad drought, one epidemic, one unlucky decade, and you wouldn't be here right now. None of us would be. The species that would eventually build cities and split atoms was reduced to a population smaller than most villages, hanging on by a thread so fragile it seems impossible we survived at all. The discovery came from a team of Chinese scientists led by Wang Jiehu at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. They were running genetic analysis on modern humans, tracking mutations backward through time like reading a molecular history book. Standard evolutionary research. Nothing that should have produced earth-shattering results. Then they saw something in the data that made no sense. Around 900,000 years ago, the genetic signatures just collapsed. It was like watching everyone on Earth suddenly disappear. The mathematical models were screaming that something catastrophic had happened. 98.7% of human ancestors wiped out in what scientists now call the most severe population bottleneck in human evolutionary history. At first, who didn't believe his own results? The numbers were too extreme, because if the calculations were correct, it meant our ancestors were reduced to a breeding population smaller than some endangered species we're desperately trying to save today. He spent years checking and rechecking, running the analysis with different methods, using DNA samples from over 3,000 people worldwide. Every single time the same horrifying result. 930,000 years ago, humanity almost ended, and the survivors stayed at critically low numbers for 117,000 years. Let that sink in. 117,000 years. That's longer than modern humans have existed as a species. For reference, all of recorded human history, from the first cities to the internet, spans only about 6,000 years. Our ancestors survived at the brink of extinction for 20 times longer than the entire span of human civilization. By the way, if you're listening to this while falling asleep or during your morning routine, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing Berlin at breakfast, Tokyo at midnight, and New York at bedtime all in the same thread. Now back to the mystery. So what could have possibly caused this near-extinction event? What force was powerful enough to wipe out 98.7% of human ancestors? And even more mysterious, how did that tiny group of survivors hold on for over 100,000 years when every mathematical model says they should have died out? The timing gives us a crucial clue. 900,000 years ago puts us right in the middle of the early Middle Pleistocene transition, when Earth's climate went completely haywire. Ice ages intensified, sea levels plummeted, and in Africa, where our ancestors lived, the climate transformed from lush woodland into harsh, arid wasteland. But was climate change enough to nearly erase humanity from existence? Some scientists think there's more to the story. Others point to massive volcanic eruptions, catastrophic droughts, or even the collapse of entire ecosystems. The evidence is written in our DNA, but reading it correctly has taken decades of scientific detective work. What makes this discovery so mind-bending is that every single person alive today carries the genetic signature of those 117,000 years of survival. The bottleneck left molecular scars in our chromosomes. It's why humans have unusually low genetic diversity compared to other species. It's why chimpanzees, who live in scattered groups across Africa, have more genetic variation than all 8 billion humans combined. We're all descendants of those 1,280 survivors who refused to give up when survival seemed impossible. The story of what happened 900,000 years ago is the most important story never told. It's humanity's greatest survival tale, and we're only beginning to understand it. In this investigation, we'll explore the cutting-edge genetic evidence, examine the climate catastrophe theory, investigate alternative explanations, and try to answer the ultimate question: what really happened during the day humanity almost vanished? Your DNA is telling a story. Right now, at this moment, encoded in the 3 billion letters of your genetic code, there's evidence of a catastrophe so complete, so devastating, that it nearly ended the human story before it had really begun. And until 2023, we couldn't read it. Here's the thing. For decades, anthropologists had noticed something weird about the human fossil record. Between about 900,000 and 600,000 years ago, human fossils basically disappear. Not everywhere, not completely, but the drop-off is dramatic. You go from finding hominin remains scattered across Africa and parts of Asia to almost nothing. It's like someone turned off the tap. For a while, scientists figured this was just bad luck. Fossilization is rare. Maybe the fossils just haven't been found yet. Maybe early humans were living in places where preservation was poor. Maybe we just needed to keep digging. Except the gap kept getting weirder. Other animal species from the same period showed up just fine in the fossil record. You could find ancient elephants, ancient pigs, ancient antelopes, but humans vanished. It was like we'd left the planet for a few 100,000 years and then mysteriously returned. Some researchers started calling it the Middle Pleistocene Gap, a mystery written in absence, in what wasn't there instead of what was. But nobody could prove what had happened. Fossils tell you where organisms died. They don't tell you where they didn't die, don't show you the populations that were too small to leave many remains. You can't prove a negative with rocks and bones. Then in 2023, a team of researchers led by Wang Jiehu, Peng Yuan Feng, and Nick Patterson published something that changed everything. They weren't digging in the dirt. They weren't searching ancient caves for fragments of bone. They were looking in the last place anyone expected to find evidence of an event. 900,000 years old. They were looking at us, at modern human DNA. The paper was dense, technical, filled with mathematical models and computational analysis. But buried in those equations was a discovery that would rewrite our understanding of human history. Using a sophisticated analytical method called FitCol, they had found evidence of a population bottleneck so severe, so prolonged, that it should have driven our ancestors to extinction and we'd been carrying the proof around in our cells this entire time. Here's how it works. Your genome, every human genome, is like an archaeological record, not of individuals but of populations. Every time two people have a child, their DNA gets shuffled, recombined in new ways. Most changes are tiny, neutral mutations that don't affect survival either way. They're just there, genetic noise accumulating generation after generation. When a population is large and diverse, you get lots of these mutations spreading through the gene pool in complex patterns. Different lineages diverge, interbreed, create a rich tapestry of genetic variation. You can think of it like a forest. In a healthy forest, you've got trees of all different ages, ancient giants hundreds of years old, mature adults, young saplings, recent sprouts. The variation tells you the forest has been there for a long time, thriving, reproducing continuously. But when a population crashes, something else happens. Most of those genetic lineages just vanish. Only a few survive, and when the population recovers, all that future genetic diversity has to come from those few survivors. It's like a forest fire that kills everything except a handful of trees in one protected valley. When the forest grows back, every single tree is descended from those survivors. The genetic record becomes simpler, less diverse, marked by a sharp discontinuity where everything changed. This is what geneticists look for when they're hunting for ancient bottlenecks. Patterns of reduced diversity. Genetic lineages that all converge on a narrow window of time. Signatures of rapid expansion after a period of constraint. The math is complicated, but the principle is straightforward. Big populations leave big genetic footprints. Small populations leave small genetic footprints. And a population that crashed and then recovered leaves a very specific kind of footprint. But here's the challenge. You're trying to read these signals after hundreds of thousands of years of additional evolution, migration, interbreeding, and change. It's like trying to read a message that's been written over, erased, written over again, partially destroyed, and then reconstructed from fragments. Traditional methods could detect recent bottlenecks, things that happened in the last few tens of thousands of years. But 900,000 years ago, that was beyond the reach of conventional genetic analysis, until FitCoal came along. FitCoal is what's called a fast infinitesimal time coalescent process, which is a mouthful, but what it means is this. Instead of trying to track individual genetic lineages backward through time, which becomes impossibly complex after a certain point, FitCoal looks at the overall patterns of genetic diversity across entire genomes. It uses advanced computational modeling to infer what past population sizes would have been necessary to create the patterns of variation we see today. Think of it like being a detective who arrives at a crime scene centuries after the crime. You can't interview witnesses. You can't dust for fingerprints. But you can analyze the overall pattern of evidence, the way everything is arranged, and use physics and probability to work backward to what must have happened. FitCoal does that with DNA. It looks at modern genomes and asks, what population history would most likely produce these exact patterns of genetic variation? When Hu and his team applied this methodology to genomic data from over 3,000 modern humans representing diverse populations across Africa, Asia, and Europe, something shocking emerged from the models. Around 930,000 years ago, the effective breeding population of human ancestors began to crash. Not slowly, not gradually, but rapidly. Within just a few thousand years, a species that had numbered somewhere around 98,000 breeding individuals collapsed to just 1,280. Let me be clear about what that number means. 1,280 breeding individuals doesn't mean 1,280 total people. In any population, not everyone is of reproductive age. There are children, elderly people, individuals who don't or can't have children. So the total population might have been closer to 3,000 or 4,000 individuals. But in terms of genetic diversity, in terms of the number of people actually passing genes to the next generation, we're talking about 1,280. For context, that's fewer breeding individuals than the current population of mountain gorillas, fewer than the number of California condors. When conservation biologists see numbers like that in modern species, they classify them as critically endangered. They start planning emergency interventions because populations that small are circling the drain of extinction. And this wasn't a brief crisis. The genetic models showed that this tiny population persisted for approximately 117,000 years. Not centuries, not even millennia, but more than 100,000 years of living on the absolute knife edge of extinction. The team ran the numbers over and over, testing different assumptions, checking for errors, making sure they weren't seeing patterns that didn't actually exist. But the signal was clear, consistent, unmistakable. Human ancestors went through a bottleneck so severe that it should have killed them, and somehow, impossibly, they survived. When the paper was published, the scientific community went into an uproar. Some researchers were skeptical, questioning whether the fit-coal methodology was really sensitive enough to detect events that ancient. Could genetic patterns really preserve information across such vast timescales? Weren't there other explanations for reduced genetic diversity? Others pointed out that the timeline matched perfectly with that mysterious gap in the fossil record. Maybe humans didn't suddenly become unfossilizable 900,000 years ago. Maybe there just weren't many humans around to fossilize. A population of 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across Africa wouldn't leave many fossils. You'd expect to find almost nothing from that period. Which is exactly what we find. Some critics argued that population structure could explain the patterns. Maybe humans weren't actually reduced to 1,280 individuals globally. Maybe different populations had been separated, making them look less diverse than they really were. But the genetic models accounted for that. The signal wasn't just reduced diversity. It was reduced diversity combined with specific patterns that indicate an actual bottleneck, a genuine collapse in population size. The debate continues. Science works like that. One study, even a groundbreaking one, isn't the final word. Other teams are analyzing the data, developing their own models, testing alternative explanations. But as of now, the bottleneck hypothesis remains the best explanation for the genetic patterns we observe, and it solves so many mysteries simultaneously. The missing fossils, the unusual patterns of genetic diversity in modern humans, the fact that all humans share certain rare genetic features, like the chromosomal fusion I mentioned earlier, that should only exist if we all descended from a very small ancestral population. Most intriguingly, it explains something that had puzzled geneticists for years. Why is human genetic diversity so low compared to other great apes? Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have about twice the genetic diversity of humans despite having a much smaller current population. Gorillas show even more variation. For years, this made no sense. Humans number in the billions. We're spread across every continent. We should be the most genetically diverse primate on Earth. Instead, we're among the least diverse. The bottleneck explains everything. We're not diverse because 900,000 years ago, we almost went extinct. And when you squeeze an entire species through a population of 1,280 breeding individuals, you lose genetic diversity forever. Those lost genetic lineages can never be recovered. They're gone, erased from our species' genetic heritage. What we have today, all our genetic variation, all our diversity, it all descends from those 1,280 survivors and whatever genetic variation they happen to carry. In a very real sense, every human alive today is related. Not in some distant, abstract way, but genuinely, traceably related. We're all cousins, all descended from that tiny group of survivors who made it through 117,000 years of near extinction. The genetic evidence is written in every cell of your body. But the evidence raised another question, one even more disturbing than the bottleneck itself. What caused it? What could possibly drive human populations from 98,000 breeding individuals down to 1,280? What kind of catastrophe could be so widespread, so prolonged, so devastating that it nearly erased humanity from the planet? The genetic analysis could tell us when it happened. It could tell us how severe it was. It could tell us how long it lasted. But it couldn't tell us why. For that, scientists had to look elsewhere. To climate records locked in ancient ice. To geological evidence of past catastrophes. To computer models of prehistoric environmental change. And what they found was terrifying. So what could possibly drive humanity to the brink of extinction? What kind of disaster could reduce our ancestors from hundreds of thousands to just 1,280 breeding individuals? The leading theory points to something that sounds almost mundane until you understand the scale. Climate change, but not the kind we talk about today. Not a few degrees of warming over a century. We're talking about a fundamental restructuring of how Earth's climate system operates. A transformation so profound that it made most of the planet uninhabitable for humans. The event is called the Mid-Pleistocene Transition, and it changed everything. Picture Earth about 1 million years ago. For millions of years before this, the planet had been playing a relatively predictable game. Ice ages would come and go in cycles lasting about 41,000 years. These cycles were driven by wobbles in Earth's orbit and tilt, what scientists call Milankovitch cycles. Every 41,000 years the planet would cool down, ice sheets would expand from the poles, sea levels would drop. Then things would warm up again, ice would retreat, and life would return to the newly exposed lands. Your ancestors has been dealing with these cycles for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew how to read the signs. When the climate started cooling, they'd migrate to warmer refuges. When it warmed again, they'd expand back into previously frozen territories. It wasn't easy, but it was manageable, predictable, the rhythm of life on a dynamic planet. Then, around 1.2 million years ago, something started going wrong. The 41,000-year cycle began breaking down. At first, the changes were subtle. Some cold periods lasted a bit longer than expected. Some warm periods were a bit shorter. But over tens of thousands of years, the pattern became clear. Earth was shifting to a new rhythm, one with cycles lasting not 41,000 years, but 100,000 years. Now you might think, okay, so the cycle got longer. What's the big deal? The big deal is what happens during those extended cycles. Longer cycles mean more extreme conditions. Ice sheets don't just expand. They grow into continent-covering monsters that lock up so much water that sea levels drop by 400 feet. Deserts don't just expand. They swallow entire regions that have been grasslands for millennia. And most importantly, the transitions between stable periods become chaotic, unpredictable, deadly. Between 950,000 and 850,000 years ago, right when our genetic bottleneck was at its worst, Earth was in the middle of this transition. The planet's climate system was basically having a nervous breakdown. The old 41,000-year rhythm was dying, but the new 100,000-year pattern hadn't stabilized yet. What emerged was chaos. Pure, unrelenting environmental chaos. The geological record from this period reads like a horror story. Ice core data from Antarctica shows temperature swings that make modern climate change look gentle. Within a few decades, temperatures drop by 10 or 15 degrees Celsius, then spike back up just as quickly. Rainfall patterns that had been stable for tens of thousands of years collapsed. Rivers that had flowed for millennia dried up. Lakes that had sustained countless generations evaporated into salt flats. And Africa, the cradle of humanity, the continent where our entire species had evolved and lived for millions of years, Africa got hit harder than anywhere else. Here's why. Africa sits astride the equator, and its climate is intimately tied to tropical weather patterns. When the global climate system destabilizes, those tropical patterns go haywire first. The monsoons that brought life-giving rains to East Africa began failing. Not every year, but randomly, unpredictably. One decade might have normal rainfall. The next might have drought so severe that vegetation died back hundreds of miles. Then a few years of normal rain would return, just long enough for ecosystems to start recovering, before another drought hit even harder. The paleoclimate data shows this wasn't gradual. Lake sediment cores from East Africa reveal rapid oscillations between wet and dry periods. Some of these transitions happened within a single human lifetime. Imagine growing up in a world of grasslands and lakes, raising your children in relative abundance, and then watching it all turn to desert before you die. That's what our ancestors experienced over and over again, but it gets worse. Because as the climate destabilized, it didn't just make things drier, it made things unpredictable, and unpredictability is the enemy of survival for any species that depends on learned behavior and cultural knowledge. Your ancestors had spent hundreds of thousands of years accumulating knowledge about their environment. Where to find water during dry seasons, which plants were edible when, where animals migrated, what stone sources produced the best tools. This knowledge was survival. It was passed down through generations, refined through trial and error, carefully maintained by elders who had lived through multiple cycles of drought and plenty. But when the environment starts changing faster than knowledge can adapt, that accumulated wisdom becomes useless. The waterholes your grandparents relied on are dry. The plants your parents taught you to harvest are dead. The animal migrations you learned to track no longer follow the old routes because the grasslands they depended on have turned to desert. And here's the truly terrifying part. It wasn't consistent. Some regions were becoming permanently uninhabitable, yes, but others were fluctuating wildly. A territory that was lush and productive one decade might be desert the next, then grassland again a generation later. This created what ecologists call a landscape trap. Groups that settled in what seemed like good territories would be decimated when conditions suddenly shifted. But groups that kept moving couldn't develop the deep local knowledge needed to exploit resources efficiently. The fossil record shows the ecological collapse in real time. Around 900,000 years ago, numerous large mammal species that had been common across Africa began disappearing from the record, not going extinct entirely but vanishing from vast regions. Their populations were fragmenting, breaking up into small isolated groups clinging to whatever refuges still had food and water. Your ancestors were experiencing exactly the same thing. The archaeological evidence shows a dramatic decline in the number of stone tool sites from this period. Places where humans had lived for tens of thousands of years were abandoned. Not temporarily, not seasonally, but permanently. The people were gone. Those who remained were compressed into an ever-shrinking number of viable territories, and this created a cascading crisis that went beyond just finding food and water. When populations get squeezed together, they start competing for resources. Groups that had coexisted peacefully when times were good turned on each other when resources became scarce. Territory that could support 10 groups in good times might barely support 2 during drought. The genetic evidence suggests something even more disturbing. Analysis of human genetic diversity from this period shows signs of not just population decline, but population fragmentation followed by collapse. Small groups were getting cut off from each other as the habitable zones shrank and fragmented. Some of these isolated groups would have died out completely when local conditions deteriorated. Others might have survived for generations in tiny refuges before succumbing to disease, inbreeding, or simple bad luck. The mathematical models are brutal when you run population simulations based on the climate data from this period. They show exactly what the genetic evidence suggests. Rapid crashes, brief recoveries, followed by even steeper crashes, over and over for tens of thousands of years, each crisis eliminating more groups, shrinking the overall population further, like a ratchet that only turns one direction, toward extinction. But here's what makes the mid-Pleistocene transition different from previous climate events. It wasn't just a matter of the planet getting colder or drier. Those kinds of changes had happened before. What made this event unprecedented was the combination of extreme conditions and extreme instability. Previous ice ages had been challenging, but they followed predictable patterns. Animals and humans could adapt by migrating, by adjusting their behavior, by waiting it out. The mid-Pleistocene transition didn't give you time to adapt. It didn't follow rules. It was chaos, pure and simple. A planet-wide climate system breaking down and rebuilding itself while everything living on the surface struggled to survive the transformation. The geological evidence is written in layers of rock and sediment across Africa. Drill cores from ancient lake beds show repeated cycles of expansion and contraction. Thick clay layers representing deep lakes alternate with thin sandy layers, representing dry periods when the lakes shrank to puddles or disappeared entirely, and the timing of these oscillations matches perfectly with the period of the human bottleneck. Ice cores from Antarctica tell a similar story. The oxygen isotope ratios, which reveal ancient temperatures, show wild fluctuations during this exact period. The temperature curve looks like a seismograph during an earthquake. Up, down, up, down. No stability, no predictability, just constant relentless change. Marine sediment cores from the ocean floor show massive influxes of dust from African deserts during this period. The dust is made of tiny particles of clay and silt, blown thousands of miles out to sea by winds raking across newly formed deserts. The more dust in the sediment, the more desert there was on land. And during the bottleneck period, the dust layers are thick. Africa was drying out on a continental scale. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from paleoclimate modeling. Scientists can now simulate ancient climate conditions using the same computer models that predict future climate change. When they run these models for the mid-Pleistocene transition, using known data about ice coverage, sea levels, and atmospheric composition, the results are sobering. The models show Africa experiencing exactly the kind of extreme climate instability that would create a population bottleneck. They show the monsoon systems failing. They show grasslands converting to desert at rates that would have been catastrophic for species that couldn't adapt quickly. They show the kind of environmental chaos that makes survival a matter of luck as much as skill. And here's the thing that keeps scientists up at night. The mid-Pleistocene transition lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. The bottleneck lasted for 117,000 years. But the worst phase, the absolute knife-edge period when humanity came closest to extinction, that probably lasted only a few thousand years. Just a few millennia when conditions became so extreme that the population crashed to its minimum. We don't know exactly what those few thousand years looked like. The geological resolution isn't fine enough to see decade-by-decade changes from 900,000 years ago. But we can imagine. We can picture the last few thousand survivors, scattered across Africa in tiny bands, watching their world die around them, watching the rains fail year after year, watching their children starve, watching other groups disappear from territories they'd occupied for generations, and somehow, impossibly, they held on. For 117,000 years they held on. But here's where the theory gets complicated, because while the climate catastrophe theory explains a lot, it doesn't explain everything. Other human species were living through the same climate chaos. Homo erectus populations in Asia were experiencing similar environmental pressures, so were other archaic humans in Europe. Yet they didn't show the same dramatic bottleneck in their genetic diversity. Why did our lineage get hit so hard? Why did we come so close to extinction when other human species survived the transition relatively intact? Some scientists think climate was only part of the story, that maybe there was another factor, another catastrophe that hit at the same time, something that made the climate disaster even worse, something that turned a survivable crisis into a near-extinction event, and they think they know what it might have been. Something that makes climate change look gentle by comparison. Something that, if it happened today, would bring our entire civilization to its knees within months. A supervolcano. Now here's where things get really terrifying, because climate change alone, as devastating as it was, might not explain everything. Some scientists think something else happened around 900,000 years ago. Something sudden, violent and catastrophic enough to push an already stressed human population to the absolute brink of extinction. They think a supervolcano exploded. Not just any volcano. We're talking about an eruption so massive it would make every volcanic disaster in recorded history look like a firecracker. The kind of eruption that happens maybe once every few 100,000 years, if you're unlucky. The kind that doesn't just affect the region around it, but changes the entire planet's climate for years, maybe decades. Now, before you think this sounds like science fiction, remember that we actually have a recent example, well, recent in geological terms. 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba in Indonesia exploded in what's considered the largest volcanic eruption of the past 2 million years. It ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere. That's enough material to bury the entire United States under a layer of volcanic debris 1/2 meter thick. The ash cloud spread across Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. Layers of Toba ash have been found in ice cores from Greenland, in sediment cores from the Indian Ocean, even in cave deposits in East Africa thousands of miles away. But the ash was just the beginning. When Toba erupted, it injected massive quantities of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, up there, above the clouds where weather can't wash it away. The sulfur dioxide reacted with water vapor to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. Millions upon millions of these droplets, each one microscopic, but collectively forming a reflective veil that wrapped around the entire planet. For years afterward, this aerosol curtain blocked sunlight. Global temperatures dropped by as much as 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. Some models suggest regional cooling could have been even more extreme, up to 15 degrees in some areas. The Indian monsoon, which billions of people depend on today, essentially shut down for years. Growing seasons shortened dramatically. Plants died, animals starved, and humans, already dealing with the normal challenges of Ice Age survival, suddenly found themselves in what volcanologists call a volcanic winter. Some researchers believe Toba nearly wiped out humanity. The genetic evidence of a severe bottleneck around that time fits the timeline, though this theory is controversial and hotly debated because the dates don't perfectly align with all the archaeological evidence. But here's the thing. If Toba, erupting 74,000 years ago, could nearly destroy modern humans who had sophisticated tools, language, and complex social networks, what would an equivalent eruption have done to our ancestors 900,000 years ago? Ancestors who were far less technologically advanced, far more vulnerable to environmental stress, already living on the edge because of the climate crisis. The answer might be, it would have been apocalyptic. So did it happen? Did a massive volcanic eruption trigger or amplify the population crash 900,000 years ago? That's where things get complicated, because unlike Toba, which happened recently enough that we can trace its ash layers and study its effects in detail, evidence from 900,000 years ago is much harder to find. Rock layers get compressed, eroded, covered by newer deposits. Ash layers that might have been distinctive when fresh become mixed with other sediments. The signature of ancient eruptions fades with time, but it doesn't disappear completely. Geologists have techniques for detecting ancient volcanic activity. They can analyze ice cores from Antarctica, where volcanic sulfates from major eruptions get trapped in annual layers of snow. They can examine deep-sea sediment cores, where ash from massive eruptions settles onto the ocean floor and gets preserved for millions of years. They can study volcanic calderas, the massive collapsed craters left behind when supervolcanoes empty their magma chambers, and date the rock layers to determine when the eruptions occurred. And when they look at the period around 900,000 years ago, they find something interesting. Not one smoking gun, but multiple signs of significant volcanic activity. There's evidence of major eruptions in Indonesia, where the Toba caldera would later form. There are traces of massive volcanic events in East Africa, right in the backyard of our human ancestors. There are sulfate spikes in ice cores that suggest significant stratospheric injections of volcanic aerosols. None of these individually reaches the scale of Toba. But here's what keeps some researchers up at night. What if there wasn't just one super eruption? What if multiple large volcanic events happened within a relatively short time span, say a few thousand years? Each one individually might not be catastrophic enough to cause a mass extinction, but combined, erupting while the climate system was already stressed from orbital changes, they could have created a cascade of environmental disasters that pushed early humans to the absolute limit of survival. Think about what happens when a supervolcano erupts. First, there's the immediate blast zone. Everything within hundreds of kilometers gets buried under pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas and rock that move at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Nothing survives. Then comes the ashfall. Thick, heavy and abrasive volcanic ash collapses roofs, contaminates water supplies, destroys vegetation. Breathing it causes severe respiratory problems. Animals that try to eat ash-covered plants suffer internal injuries. The ash can fall thousands of kilometers from the eruption site, turning day into night, covering fertile lands with a sterile grey blanket that nothing can grow through. But that's still just the local and regional effects. The global catastrophe begins when the eruption column punches through the troposphere into the stratosphere. Up there, above the weather, sulfur dioxide gas spreads rapidly around the planet, forming that reflective aerosol curtain. Within months, global temperatures begin to drop. The drop isn't uniform. Some regions cool more than others. The disruption to atmospheric circulation patterns causes some areas to become much drier, others wetter. Monsoon systems, which billions of organisms depend on, either weaken or shift their patterns. Growing seasons shorten. In the worst affected areas, summer essentially doesn't happen. Temperatures that should reach 25 degrees Celsius barely make it to 15. Plants adapted to warm conditions die. Animals that depend on those plants starve. Predators that depend on those animals follow them into extinction. Now imagine you're one of those early humans, already struggling with a climate that's been getting colder and drier for thousands of years. Your population is already stressed, already split into small groups clinging to whatever refuges still have reliable water and food. Then the volcano erupts. Maybe you're lucky and you're not in the immediate blast zone, but within days the ash starts falling. The sky turns grey, then black. Temperatures plummet. The water sources you depend on become contaminated with volcanic debris. The animals you hunt either die or migrate away looking for food. The plants you gather for supplementary nutrition die from lack of sunlight and the toxic compounds in the ash. You might survive the first year. You have knowledge, tools, the ability to plan ahead. You stockpiled food when times were good. You know how to find water even when sources are contaminated. You can make fire, build shelter, work together with your group, but the volcanic winter doesn't end after 1 year. The aerosols stay in the stratosphere for years. Each summer is colder than the last. Each winter pushes you closer to the edge. Children start dying from malnutrition and respiratory problems caused by breathing ash-contaminated air. The elderly, unable to withstand the cold, succumb to hypothermia. Even the strong adults are weakening, their immune systems compromised by constant stress and inadequate nutrition. After 3 years, maybe 4, your group of 30 is down to 15. After 5 years, you're down to 8. The group in the next valley over, the one you traded with occasionally, went silent last winter. You assume they're all dead. Another group, further away, sent a messenger last summer asking for help. You had nothing to give them. You don't know if they survived. This is what a supervolcano can do. And if one erupted during the climate crisis 900,000 years ago, it could easily explain why human populations crash so dramatically. But here's where the hypothesis gets even more disturbing. What if it wasn't just one eruption? What if, during that critical period when humans were already struggling, the planet experienced a volcanic pulse, multiple large eruptions occurring within a few thousand years of each other? This isn't unprecedented. We know from geological records that volcanic activity tends to cluster. There are periods of intense activity followed by long, quiet intervals. The mechanisms are complex, involving changes in tectonic stress patterns, fluctuations in magma generation rates, even feedbacks where one eruption can trigger others by redistributing pressure in the Earth's crust. If 900,000 years ago happened to coincide with one of these high-activity periods, early humans would have faced a nightmare scenario. Just as they were beginning to recover from one volcanic winter, another eruption would plunge them back into crisis. Populations that had barely survived the first event would be decimated by the second. Refugees that had supported small groups through one disaster would fail during the next. The archaeological record from this period is frustratingly sparse. We don't have enough fossil sites, enough stone tools, enough preserved remains to reconstruct exactly what was happening to human populations year by year. But what we do have is suggestive. There's a dramatic reduction in the number of archaeological sites. The sites that do exist from this period tend to be in very specific locations. Caves near permanent water sources, coastal areas where marine resources provided a buffer against terrestrial ecosystem collapse, highland regions that might have escaped the worst of the volcanic winters because they were already adapted to cold conditions. This is exactly the pattern you'd expect if a volcanic catastrophe had struck. Humans retreating to the most reliable refuges, abandoning territories that had become uninhabitable, consolidating into smaller and smaller groups as the death toll mounted. But there's a problem with the supervolcano hypothesis. A big one. We haven't found definitive evidence of an eruption large enough to cause a global catastrophe at exactly 900,000 years ago. The volcanic activity we can detect from that period consists of multiple moderate to large eruptions, but no single super-eruption on the scale of Toba. This doesn't disprove the hypothesis, because volcanic evidence from nearly 1 million years ago is incomplete. Major eruptions in certain locations might leave little trace if the ash was deposited in areas that have since been heavily eroded or covered by newer rock layers. But it does mean we can't say for certain that a supervolcano caused the bottleneck. What we can say is that volcanic activity definitely would have made the climate crisis worse. Even moderate eruptions, if they occurred during a period when climate was already stressed, could push ecosystems past critical tipping points. The combination of orbital forcing driving climate change, plus volcanic aerosols amplifying the cooling, plus the direct effects of ashfall on local ecosystems, could easily have created the catastrophic conditions necessary to reduce human populations to the brink of extinction. Some researchers go further. They suggest that volcanic eruptions might have triggered the chromosome fusion that marks all humans today. High levels of volcanic ash contain fluoride and other compounds that can damage DNA. If early human populations were exposed to volcanic ashfall over extended periods, it might have increased mutation rates, creating the conditions under which a major chromosomal rearrangement could occur and spread through the population. This is speculative, extremely controversial, and lacks direct evidence. But it's the kind of creative thinking that emerges when scientists try to explain how a single genetic change swept through the entire human species at exactly the same time we were undergoing a catastrophic population collapse. The truth is, we may never know exactly what role volcanic activity played in the crisis 900,000 years ago. The evidence is too fragmentary, the timeline too uncertain. But what we do know is sobering. We know that supervolcanoes are real and that they can cause global catastrophes. We know that when they erupt during periods of climate stress, the effects are amplified. We know that early human populations were small, vulnerable, and living on the edge of what was environmentally possible. And we know that somehow, despite everything, whether it was volcanic winters or climate change or both working together, a tiny remnant of humanity survived. 1,280 individuals who refused to die, who found a way to endure when endurance seemed impossible. But where were they? What allowed these specific populations to survive when so many others perished? So here's the question that keeps anthropologists awake at night. Where exactly did humanity hide during those 117,000 years of near extinction? Because here's what we know. 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across an entire continent. That's roughly the population of a small village trying to survive in an area the size of Africa. And not the lush, diverse Africa we know today. We're talking about Africa during one of the worst climate disasters in planetary history. Most of it was uninhabitable. Vast stretches of desert where nothing could survive. Dried up lake beds that had once teemed with life. Rivers that had stopped flowing decades earlier. Grasslands that had turned to dust. So where could you hide? Where were the refuges that kept humanity alive when almost everywhere else meant death? The answer lies in understanding what living things absolutely need to survive. Water first. Always water. You can go weeks without food if you have to, but 3 days without water and you're done. So whatever refugees sustained our ancestors, they had to have reliable water sources. Not just during the wet season, but year-round, decade after decade, century after century, even during the worst droughts. This immediately narrows down the possibilities. Most of Africa during the bottleneck would have been completely dry for months at a time. But some places, very specific places, would have retained water even when everything around them was dying. Underground aquifers feeding permanent springs, deep lakes that held water even when smaller bodies evaporated, coastal areas where fog and sea spray provided just enough moisture, river valleys where the last trickles of water concentrated into pools that never quite dried up. The most likely refuge zones were probably along the coasts, not the beaches themselves, but the interface zones where land meets sea. These areas would have provided multiple advantages. First, water from coastal springs and fog condensation. Second, food from the ocean, shellfish, fish, seaweed, resources that don't depend on rainfall. Third, and this is crucial, a linear geography that made it easier for small groups to maintain contact. Think about it. If you're living inland, other human groups could be in literally any direction, hundreds of miles away across hostile territory. But if you're living along a coastline, you know that other groups, if they exist, are either north or south along the same shore. You can send scouts in just 2 directions instead of 360. You can follow the coastline and eventually find others. The geography itself creates connection. Archaeological evidence, sparse as it is, supports this coastal refuge hypothesis. Some of the oldest sites that show continuous human occupation through the bottleneck period are located near ancient coastlines. Caves along what is now the South African coast show evidence of shellfish consumption going back hundreds of thousands of years. These weren't just occasional snacks. These were systematic exploitation of marine resources. People living generation after generation in the same locations because those locations provided reliable food and water when everything else had failed. But coasts weren't the only refuges. Deep in the interior of Africa, there were isolated pockets of habitability. Highland regions where elevation created localized rainfall. Volcanic areas where geothermal springs provided permanent water. And most intriguingly, massive cave systems that offered shelter from temperature extremes and protection from predators. These cave refuges would have been more than just camping spots. They would have been multi-generational homes. Archaeological evidence from various African caves shows layers of occupation stretching across millennia. The same caves used over and over, sometimes continuously, sometimes with gaps where populations disappeared and then returned decades or centuries later. These gaps in the archaeological record, they're not just missing data. They're evidence of the desperate game of population whack-a-mole, that was playing out during the bottleneck. Groups occupying a cave for generations, then vanishing when conditions became too harsh. Then other groups, or survivors from the same group, recolonizing the same cave when conditions improved. River valleys were another critical refuge type. Even during severe droughts, major rivers maintained some flow, fed by distant rainfall in their headwaters. Along these rivers, narrow ribbons of greenery would have persisted, oases of life in an otherwise dead landscape. Our ancestors would have clung to these river valleys like lifelines. Archaeological sites from the bottleneck period cluster along ancient river courses, places where the Nile, the Congo, the Zambezi, and countless smaller rivers created corridors of survival through the wasteland. But here's where the survival story gets psychologically intense. Imagine being part of one of these refuge populations. Your entire world is maybe 50 square miles of habitable territory. Beyond that, in every direction, death. You've never travelled more than a few days from your birthplace because there's nowhere to go. Everyone you know is related to you. Your spouse is probably your cousin. Your children will marry their cousins. There's literally nobody else. The psychological pressure must have been immense. Humans are social creatures. We're adapted to live in communities of 100 and 200 individuals with regular contact with other groups. But during the bottleneck, typical group sizes were probably 20-30 people. That's it. That's your entire social world. Everyone you'll ever meet. Everyone you'll ever talk to. Everyone you'll ever depend on. And the social dynamics would have been brutally unforgiving. In a group of 25 people, you can't afford conflict. You can't have feuds that split the community. You can't have someone decide to leave and take half the group with them because you'd both fall below viable population size. Whatever personal problems arose, whatever personality clashes, whatever jealousies and resentments, they had to be managed. Cooperation wasn't optional, it was absolute necessity. This created incredible selection pressure for social intelligence. The individuals who survived and reproduced during the bottleneck weren't necessarily the strongest or fastest. They were the ones who could maintain social harmony, who could resolve conflicts before they escalated, who could suppress their own impulses for the good of the group, who could cooperate even when cooperation was difficult. The genetic consequences of this isolation were equally dramatic. In population genetics, there's a concept called inbreeding depression. When populations get too small and isolated, close relatives start breeding with each other, and harmful recessive genes get expressed more frequently. Birth defects increase. Genetic diseases become more common. Fertility drops. The population enters a death spiral. Somehow our ancestors avoided this fate, but only barely. The genetic evidence shows we did suffer significant inbreeding. Every person alive today carries recessive genetic variants that would have become much more common during the bottleneck, but we survived because those 1,280 breeding individuals weren't all in one place breeding with their siblings. They were distributed across multiple refuge populations, and critically, those populations maintained enough contact to exchange mates occasionally. This mate exchange would have been the most important activity in any refuge community. Not hunting, not gathering, not tool-making. Finding ways to connect with other groups and exchange breeding partners. Because every community would have understood, probably not in our modern genetic terms, but through generations of hard experience, that too much inbreeding led to weaker children. Fewer births, more deaths, group extinction. So they would have sent out scouts, young men and women travelling along coastlines, up river valleys, across the least hostile stretches of terrain, searching for other groups. These journeys would have been incredibly dangerous. Travel meant leaving the safety of known territory. It meant crossing areas with limited water and food. It meant exposure to predators and the elements. Many scouts probably never returned, but some did. And when they found another group, the meetings would have been momentous. Two communities who maybe hadn't seen outsiders in generations suddenly in contact. These encounters would have been opportunities for genetic exchange, trade, information sharing, stories about conditions in other areas, knowledge about water sources and food resources, new techniques and technologies, and most importantly, marriage partners. The archaeological evidence for these connections is tantalizing. Stone tools from coastal regions show up in inland sites hundreds of miles away. Raw materials from highland areas appear in lowland locations. This isn't random distribution. This is trade, systematic movement of goods across long distances. And trade means contact. It means networks. It means that even during the worst of the bottleneck, human groups weren't completely isolated. They were maintaining tenuous connections across vast distances. These connections might have been maintained through what anthropologists call down-the-line exchange. Group A trades with Group B trades with Group C trades with Group D. Resources move along the chain, but no single individual travels the entire distance. This kind of network could maintain genetic and cultural connections across thousands of miles without requiring any individual to make impossibly dangerous journeys. But some refuge populations probably did become completely isolated, cut off from all contact with other groups for generations, maybe centuries. These populations would have faced the harshest genetic consequences: rapid loss of diversity, accumulation of harmful mutations, declining fertility. Most of these isolated populations probably went extinct. They became evolutionary dead ends, branches of humanity that didn't make it through the bottleneck. The fossil record hints at this. There are gaps, mysterious absences in the archaeological timeline, sites that show occupation, then abandonment, then nothing for thousands of years. These gaps probably represent local extinctions, refuge populations that held on for centuries but ultimately couldn't sustain themselves. The network survived, but individual nodes kept failing. Meanwhile, the survivors were adapting. The refuge populations that made it through the bottleneck weren't just hanging on. They were innovating, developing new survival technologies that would prove crucial when the climate finally began to improve. The harsh conditions created a kind of evolutionary pressure cooker. Every improvement in tool-making, food processing, or social organization provided immediate survival advantages. Some of the most important innovations probably emerged during this period. Better fire control, techniques for maintaining embers during long journeys between refuge sites, improved food storage, methods for preserving meat and plant materials during scarce periods, advanced tool-making, creating more efficient cutting implements from limited raw materials, and most critically, enhanced social technologies, systems for maintaining cooperation and knowledge transfer across generations. But perhaps the most profound adaptation was psychological. The refuge populations that survived weren't just physically adapted to harsh environments. They were mentally adapted to uncertainty, to constant crisis, to the knowledge that any year might bring catastrophe. This psychological resilience, this ability to maintain hope and cooperation, even when conditions seemed hopeless, might be the most important legacy of the bottleneck. Because here's the thing about living through 117,000 years of near extinction. It's not just a few bad decades. It's not even a few bad millennia. It's thousands of generations born into crisis, living in crisis, dying in crisis. The refuge populations would have had no memory of better times, no oral traditions about an ancient golden age when life was easy. They would have simply accepted that life was hard, that survival was uncertain, and that every day you stayed alive was a victory, and yet they kept going. Generation after generation, century after century, millennium after millennium, small groups of humans clinging to tiny refuges in a hostile world, but never giving up. Always finding ways to survive just one more year. Always sending out scouts to find other groups. Always maintaining the networks and connections that kept genetic exchange possible. Always innovating and adapting and cooperating. These weren't just survivors. These were the most resilient humans who had ever lived, forged by conditions that would have destroyed any other species, tested by a crisis that lasted longer than all of recorded human history, and somehow, impossibly, they made it through. The refugees were scattered across Africa, tiny islands of habitability in a sea of death, but they held. The populations crashed to numbers that should have meant extinction, but they survived. And when the climate finally began to improve, when the rain started returning and the grasslands began to recover, these refuge survivors were ready to explode back across the landscape. But they weren't the same species that had entered the bottleneck. They had been transformed. Now here's where this story takes a turn that's going to mess with your head. Because everything we've talked about so far, the climate catastrophe, the population crash, 1,280 people clinging to survival in scattered refugees across Africa, all of it sounds like an absolute disaster. The worst thing that could have happened to our species. And it was. But it might also have been the best thing that ever happened to us. I'm serious. That bottleneck, those 117,000 years of near extinction, might be the reason you can do calculus, compose symphonies, or even just figure out how to navigate a new city using a map. The crisis that almost killed us might have been the evolutionary pressure cooker that made us human. Let me explain the paradox. In normal times, evolution is lazy. Not actually lazy, but conservative. When a species is doing well, when populations are large and stable and resources are abundant, there's no strong pressure to change. Sure, evolution still happens. Random mutations occur. Some individuals are slightly better adapted than others, but the differences are subtle. Natural selection operates slowly. A species can coast for millions of years with only minor modifications. But put that same species through a crisis, through 117,000 years of barely surviving, and evolution stops being lazy. It becomes ruthless. Every generation becomes a test. Every individual either has what it takes to survive in these new horrific conditions, or they don't make it. The ones who survive aren't just lucky, they're different. They have some combination of traits, genetic, behavioral, cognitive, that gives them an edge when death is hunting everyone. And here's the crucial part. In a small population going through an extended crisis, beneficial mutations can spread incredibly fast. Put a useful new gene variant in a population of millions, and it might take 50,000 years to become common. Put that same variant in a population of 1,280, where everyone's related within a few generations, and it can sweep through the entire species in just a few thousand years. The genetic evidence suggests this is exactly what happened to us. When scientists analyze the human genome, looking for genes that show signs of strong positive selection, meaning they spread rapidly because they provided major advantages, they keep finding the same pattern. These genes show evidence of selection starting right around, wait for it, 900,000 years ago. right when the bottleneck began. Let's talk about what was actually being selected for. First, brain development. Now, human brains had been getting bigger for millions of years before the bottleneck. Our Australopithecine ancestors, the ones walking around 3 million years ago, had brains about the size of modern chimpanzees, maybe 400 cubic centimeters. By the time Homo erectus showed up 2 million years ago, brains had grown to about 900 cubic centimeters. Bigger, but still only about 2/3 the size of a modern human brain. The really dramatic changes came later, and specifically they came during and after the bottleneck period. By 800,000 years ago, right as populations were beginning to recover, average brain size in human ancestors had jumped to around 1,100 cubic centimeters. By 500,000 years ago, we're seeing specimens with brains in the 1,200 to 1,400 range. Modern human size. This isn't gradual change, this is evolution in fast forward. But it's not just size, the shape was changing too. Modern human skulls are distinct. We have high foreheads, reduced brow ridges, and most importantly, expanded frontal and parietal lobes. These are the brain regions responsible for abstract thinking, planning, problem-solving, language processing, the parts that make us cognitively human. And the archaeological evidence suggests these changes were happening right alongside the population recovery. Now, growing bigger brains is expensive. Metabolically, your brain uses about 20% of your body's energy, despite being only 2% of your body weight. For a species barely surviving, where every calorie matters, spending more energy on brain tissue only makes sense if those bigger brains are providing serious survival advantages. So what were those advantages? Intelligence, obviously, but let's be more specific. During the bottleneck, the humans who survived would have been the ones who could solve problems their ancestors never faced. Finding water sources in landscapes that had been dry for generations, identifying new edible plants when traditional food sources disappeared, developing new hunting techniques for animals they'd never encountered before. Every one of these challenges rewards cognitive flexibility, the ability to observe, reason, innovate, and remember. The ones who could do this, who could look at an unfamiliar problem and figure out a solution, they lived long enough to have children. The ones who couldn't, didn't. For 117,000 years, this selection pressure never let up. Generation after generation, the smartest, most innovative, most cognitively flexible individuals had a survival edge. And gradually, the entire species shifted toward higher intelligence. But intelligence alone wouldn't have been enough. You can be the smartest human in your refuge, but if you can't convince others to cooperate with your plans, if you can't form alliances, if you can't maintain relationships across your small scattered population, you're not going to make it. This is where social intelligence comes in, and the genetic evidence suggests it was under equally intense selection. Humans are weird compared to other primates. We can cooperate with strangers. We can form stable alliances with people we're not related to. We can maintain relationships with dozens, even hundreds of individuals simultaneously. We have complex emotions that seem specifically designed to facilitate cooperation. Guilt, shame, empathy, moral outrage. These aren't luxuries, these are survival tools, and they were being refined during the bottleneck. Think about those meta-population networks we discussed. Small groups scattered across Africa, connected by kinship and trade. For those networks to function, individuals needed to be able to trust each other across distances and time. If you give me food today when you have surplus and I'm starving, I need to remember that debt and repay it next year when our situations are reversed. This requires sophisticated social cognition, mental accounting, moral reasoning, reputation management. The populations that developed these abilities, that could maintain cooperation even under stress, they survived. The ones that descended into conflict and distrust when resources got scarce, they didn't. Natural selection was building a foundation for the complex societies we see today, not consciously, not purposefully, but inevitably. Cooperation was survival. Antisocial behavior was death. And then there's language. This is the big one, the adaptation that might have mattered more than anything else. Because language isn't just communication, it's knowledge transfer, it's cultural evolution, it's the ability to teach your children everything you learned without them having to rediscover it through trial and error. And in a crisis, that's the difference between survival and extinction. Now, we don't know exactly when human language evolved. Some researchers think it goes back 2 million years, developing gradually alongside increasing brain size. Others argue for a more recent origin, maybe 500,000 years ago, associated with specific genetic changes. But there's growing evidence that something crucial happened to human language capabilities right around the bottleneck period. The gene FOXP2 is involved in language processing and speech production. Mutations in this gene cause severe language disorders. When researchers traced the evolutionary history of FOXP2, they found something fascinating. The modern human version of this gene shows evidence of strong positive selection starting approximately 800,000 years ago. Right when populations were recovering from the bottleneck, right when the scattered human groups would have needed sophisticated communication more than ever. Imagine you're living in one of those refuges. Your survival depends on knowledge. Where to find water during the dry season, which plants are edible and which will kill you, how to track game animals across different terrains, how to predict weather patterns, how to make and maintain tools. This information is life and death, and you need to pass it to your children with perfect accuracy. Gestures and simple vocalizations might work for basic concepts, but complex, detailed, abstract information, for that you need real language, grammar, syntax, the ability to describe things that aren't immediately present, to talk about past events and future possibilities, to convey hypothetical scenarios. The groups that developed this capability could accumulate and transmit knowledge across generations. The groups that didn't, couldn't. And in a survival situation, knowledge is everything. Over thousands of generations, selection would favor any genetic variant that improved language ability, better vocal control, enhanced auditory processing, improved memory for linguistic information, faster language acquisition in children. The genetic changes would be small, subtle, but cumulative. And in a bottleneck population where everyone's related, they could spread fast. By the time the population began recovering, our ancestors might have possessed something approaching modern human language. Not necessarily the same as what we speak today, but fundamentally similar. Complex, grammatical, capable of expressing abstract concepts. This would explain something that's always puzzled anthropologists: how quickly human technology and culture evolved after the bottleneck. From about 800,000 years ago onward, we see archaeological evidence of increasingly sophisticated behavior. More complex tools, controlled use of fire becoming universal, the first evidence of systematic hunting of large game, long-distance trade in raw materials like obsidian and ochre, and eventually, as we discussed, the emergence of symbolic behavior, burial practices, possibly art and ritual. This is all happening at a pace that would have been impossible without sophisticated language to facilitate knowledge transfer. But here's what really drives the point home. When geneticists compare modern human populations from around the world, we all show remarkably similar cognitive capabilities. Sure, cultures differ, languages differ, but the underlying cognitive hardware, our capacity for abstract reasoning, for language, for innovation, it's universal. Every human population on Earth shares these abilities. And the most likely explanation is that they were already present in the bottleneck population. They were selected for so strongly during those 117,000 years that they became fixed, universal traits of our species. We're all descendants of people who are smart enough, social enough, and verbally sophisticated enough to survive the worst environmental crisis in human history. Those traits aren't just part of our genetic heritage. They're the foundation of everything that makes us human. Of course, not everyone agrees with this interpretation. Some scientists argue that what we call behavioral modernity, the full package of cognitive abilities that define modern humans, didn't emerge until much later, maybe 300,000 years ago in Africa, possibly as recently as 70,000 years ago. They point to the archaeological record, which doesn't show clear evidence of symbolic behavior until long after the bottleneck. Where's the art? Where are the complex tools? Where's the proof that these people were cognitively modern? It's a fair question, and the honest answer is, we don't know for sure. Cognitive abilities don't fossilize. We can only infer them from indirect evidence. Maybe the bottleneck population had the cognitive hardware for modern behavior, but hadn't yet developed the cultural software to express it. Maybe the harsh conditions prevented them from creating art and elaborate tools even though they were capable of it. Or maybe the critics are right, and modern cognition emerged later through different evolutionary pressures. But the genetic evidence keeps pointing back to the bottleneck period. Those genes under strong selection, those neural adaptations, the timing lines up too perfectly to be coincidence. Something fundamental changed in human evolution during those 117,000 years. We went in as one kind of hominin and came out as something different, something that would eventually become capable of building civilizations, creating art and music, developing science and philosophy. Which brings us to the ultimate question, the one that keeps researchers up at night. Would we be who we are today without this near-extinction event? If the climate hadn't crashed 900,000 years ago, if populations had remained large and stable, would we have evolved the same cognitive abilities? Or would we still be making simple tools and living in small bands, barely different from our ancestors 1,000,000 years earlier? Nobody knows. You can't rerun evolution to see what would have happened. But the timing, the genetic evidence, the archaeological record, it all suggests that the bottleneck was transformative. That sometimes, when everything goes wrong, when a species is pushed to the absolute brink of extinction, the survivors emerge not just different, but better adapted, more capable, more resilient. We are who we are in part because our ancestors nearly died out, because they survived conditions that should have killed them, because natural selection had 117,000 years to refine and perfect the traits that made survival possible. Our intelligence, our social sophistication, our capacity for language and innovation, these might all be gifts from the bottleneck, evolutionary adaptations forged in the crucible of near extinction. Every time you solve a problem, learn a new skill, or cooperate with someone to achieve a goal neither of you could accomplish alone, you're using abilities that were shaped by that ancient crisis. You're the product of the survivors. All of us are. and that changes everything about how we understand ourselves. But if the bottleneck made us human, it also made us vulnerable in ways we're only beginning to understand. But wait. Before we accept this entire narrative as settled fact, we need to talk about something crucial. The story I've just told you, the one about 1,280 breeding individuals surviving 117,000 years of climate hell, it's not universally accepted. Not even close. In fact, some of the smartest population geneticists in the world think it's fundamentally wrong. And they have really good reasons for their skepticism. Because here's the thing about scientific research. Every study depends on models, assumptions, mathematical frameworks that try to reduce the messy complexity of reality into something we can actually calculate. And when those assumptions change, the entire story can change with them. The Fit Coal study that first identified the ancient bottleneck, it used a specific model of population genetics called the pairwise sequentially Markovian coalescent model. That's a mouthful, but basically it assumes human populations mixed randomly, that genetic mutations accumulated at steady rates, and that we can work backward from modern DNA to reconstruct ancient population sizes. But what if those assumptions are wrong? What if the reality was messier, more complicated, more interesting than any mathematical model can capture? Let's start with the most serious challenge to the bottleneck theory, the structured population hypothesis. Some researchers argue that what looks like a dramatic population crash might actually be something completely different. Population structure. Imagine this. 900,000 years ago, you don't have one big African population that suddenly crashes. Instead, you have multiple separate populations that have been isolated from each other for thousands of years. Maybe one group lives in the forests of Central Africa, another in the grasslands of East Africa, a third in the southern tip of the continent. These groups rarely interbreed. They're separated by hundreds of miles, by geographic barriers, by different environments that select for different adaptations. They're evolving independently, accumulate in different mutations, becoming genetically distinct. Now, when geneticists today analyze DNA from all modern humans, they're seeing the combined signature of all these ancient populations, but their models assume random mixing, one big population where everyone had an equal chance of breeding with everyone else. When you force that assumption onto data that actually comes from multiple isolated groups, something weird happens. The math interprets the isolation as a population crash. It sees the reduced genetic diversity between groups and concludes there must have been fewer people. But really there were plenty of people. They just weren't mixing. It's like looking at a city and only counting the people in one neighborhood. Your population estimate would be way too low, not because the city is empty, but because you're not seeing the whole picture. This matters because it completely changes the story. If humans were living in structured populations, there was no bottleneck, no near-extinction event, no 117,000 years of desperate survival. Just normal human populations doing what populations do, spreading out, adapting to different environments, occasionally exchanging genes when groups encountered each other. Some proponents of this theory point to modern hunter-gatherer societies as evidence. Groups like the San people of southern Africa or the various populations of the Amazon basin show exactly this pattern. Genetically distinct populations living in the same general region, but rarely interbreeding, maintaining separate identities for thousands of years. Why couldn't our ancient ancestors have been doing the same thing? The counter-argument is that the genetic signature is too extreme for simple population structure to explain. Yes, isolated populations reduce genetic diversity between groups, but the bottleneck signal in our DNA goes deeper than that. It shows up in every human population worldwide, suggesting a genuinely global reduction in numbers, not just regional isolation. But the debate isn't settled. Different statistical models produce different results, and we're constantly refining our methods for analyzing ancient genetic patterns. Then there's the interbreeding hypothesis. This one gets really weird. What if the apparent bottleneck isn't about human population size at all, but about mixing with other hominin species? Remember, 900,000 years ago, Africa wasn't just home to our direct ancestors. There were probably multiple hominin species wandering around, some closely related to us, some more distant cousins. We know from later periods that different human species interbred. Modern humans and Neanderthals, modern humans and Denisovans, Neanderthals and Denisovans. These interbreeding events leave distinctive genetic signatures, patterns that can confuse population genetic models if you're not accounting for them properly. Here's the scenario. Maybe around 900,000 years ago, our ancestors encountered and bred with a closely related but genetically distinct hominin species. One we haven't discovered yet, one that left no fossils but did leave its DNA. This hybridization event would inject new genetic variants into our ancestral population, creating exactly the kind of genetic patterns that might look like a population bottleneck if you're using models that assume all genetic variation comes from one continuously breeding population. The reduced diversity, the long-shared chromosomal segments, the signatures of ancient selection, they could all be artifacts of hybridization rather than evidence of near extinction. Sound far-fetched? Maybe. But we keep discovering new evidence of ancient interbreeding events we never suspected. In 2019, researchers found genetic evidence that an unknown ghost lineage of hominins contributed DNA to modern West African populations. In 2021, another study identified signatures of interbreeding between Neanderthals and a mysterious archaic human population in Europe. Every few years, someone finds another hidden chapter of human prehistory written in genetic data. Why couldn't there be another one right around 900,000 years ago, scrambling our interpretation of the evidence? Now let's talk about disease, because there's one scenario that could explain a rapid, severe population crash without requiring any climate catastrophe or volcanic eruption. A pandemic. Picture this. 900,000 years ago, human populations are growing, spreading, developing more complex social networks. Groups that used to be isolated are starting to interact more regularly. Trade routes are forming, migration is increasing, and then someone somewhere gets sick. Maybe it's a virus that jumps from animals to humans. Maybe it's a bacterial infection that mutates into something more virulent. Whatever it is, it spreads fast, faster than our ancestors have ever encountered. Without modern medicine, without even basic understanding of disease transmission, early humans would have been helpless against a sufficiently deadly pathogen. The Black Death killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in just a few years. Smallpox decimated Native American populations when Europeans arrived, killing up to 90% in some regions. HIV has killed over 35 million people worldwide despite all our modern medical technology. Now imagine a pandemic hitting a small, scattered human population with no immunity, no medical knowledge, no way to develop treatments. It could absolutely crash population numbers to near extinction levels, and it would happen fast within just a few generations, matching the timeline suggested by the genetic data. The problem with the pandemic theory is that diseases don't usually leave clear genetic signatures the way population bottlenecks do. Yes, some genetic variants that provided disease resistance would be selected for, but tracking those signatures 900,000 years later is extraordinarily difficult. Genes that helped survive ancient diseases might have been selected out later, or might be mixed up with genes that were selected for completely different reasons. We'd need to find direct evidence of ancient pathogens, maybe in fossilized remains, but the preservation of microscopic organisms over nearly 1 million years is next to impossible. Still, some researchers think they've found suggestive evidence. Certain genes involved in immune function show signatures of very ancient selection pressures dating to roughly the right time period. Could these be remnants of a pandemic our ancestors barely survived? Maybe. But correlation isn't causation, and immune genes are under constant selection pressure from multiple sources. It's hard to isolate any single disease event from the background noise of continuous pathogen evolution. Then there are the extraterrestrial factors. And before you roll your eyes, this isn't ancient aliens territory. This is legitimate planetary science. Earth gets hit by asteroids. Not Hollywood apocalypse level impacts, but significant strikes that can cause regional or even global climate effects. Around 790,000 years ago, there's geological evidence of a significant impact event. The Australasian tektite field, a massive scatter of impact glass covering roughly 10% of Earth's surface, was created by an asteroid impact. We haven't found the crater yet, probably because it's buried under ice in Antarctica or submerged in deep ocean. But the impact debris is undeniable. The timing is tantalizing. Right in the middle of the proposed bottleneck period, an impact large enough to scatter debris across Asia and Australia would have been powerful enough to affect global climate. Dust and aerosols injected into the atmosphere. Possible cooling effects lasting years or decades. Regional devastation in the impact zone. Could this have been the trigger or at least a major contributing factor to the human population crash? Some researchers think so. They argue we've been too focused on volcanic and climate causes, ignoring the possibility that an extraterrestrial impact could have been the catalyst that pushed human populations to the edge. But again, the evidence is circumstantial. The tektite field proves an impact happened, but proving it caused human population decline is much harder. We'd need to show that the climate changes associated with the impact align precisely with the human genetic bottleneck timeline, and we'd need to rule out other causes that were happening simultaneously, like that minor problem of the entire climate system going haywire and ice sheets advancing across the planet. Now here's where things get really interesting. The African multi-regionalism theory. This hypothesis suggests that modern humans didn't evolve from a single small population in one place. Instead, we emerge from multiple ancient African populations that interbred occasionally, but evolved largely independently. Under this model, the appearance of a bottleneck is actually the genetic signature of these populations merging. Imagine you have 5 separate populations living across Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. Each is adapting to its local environment, accumulating its own unique genetic variants. Then, around 900,000 years ago, climate changes forced these groups into overlapping territories, maybe refuges where water and resources are still available. They start interbreeding more regularly. Their distinct genetic lineages merge, and what we see today, when we analyze the DNA of their descendants, looks like a population bottleneck, but it's actually a population convergence. Multiple separate lineages fusing into one. This theory has some really interesting implications. It would explain why the bottleneck signal is so strong, you're not just seeing reduced population size, you're seeing the actual merger of distinct genetic lineages. It would also explain some of the odd patterns in our chromosomal structure, like that fused chromosome 2. Maybe it emerged in one population and then spread to others through interbreeding. Most intriguingly, it would mean the evolutionary changes attributed to bottleneck selection pressure might actually be the result of mixing different adaptive strategies that had evolved in separate populations. Hybrid vigor on a species-wide scale. But the criticism of this theory is that it requires some very specific conditions. Multiple populations all converging at roughly the same time, gene flow between them increasing suddenly rather than gradually, and all of this happening in a way that leaves exactly the genetic signature we observe today. That's a lot of coincidences. Possible, sure. Probable? That's where scientists disagree. So why can't we just figure this out? Why? With all our modern technology and sophisticated genetic analysis, are we still debating what happened 900,000 years ago? The answer is frustrating but honest, because we're trying to reconstruct events from indirect evidence. It's like trying to figure out what happened at a party by examining a few photographs taken the next morning. You can make educated guesses, you can build plausible scenarios, but you can't be certain. Every genetic model requires assumptions about mutation rates which might not be constant, assumptions about population structure, which was probably more complex than any model captures, assumptions about selective pressures which we can only infer indirectly. Change any of these assumptions and the conclusions change too. Different research teams use different models, different data sets, different statistical approaches, and unsurprisingly they reach different conclusions. Some studies support the bottleneck hypothesis strongly, others find the evidence unconvincing. Still others propose modified versions that incorporate elements of multiple theories. This isn't scientific failure. This is science working exactly as it should. Multiple hypotheses competing, each being tested against the evidence, the field gradually converging on better and better explanations. What's becoming clear is that the truth is probably more complicated than any single theory captures. Maybe there was a population crash, but it was driven by multiple factors simultaneously. Climate change plus disease plus population structure plus occasional interbreeding with other hominins. Maybe different human populations experienced different severity of crisis, some crashing to near extinction while others remained relatively stable. Maybe the recovery involved both population growth and convergence of previously separate groups. The honest answer is we don't know for certain, not yet. But we're getting closer. New techniques for analyzing ancient DNA are being developed constantly. Archaeological discoveries keep adding new pieces to the puzzle. Climate science is refining our understanding of what Earth was like during this critical period. In another decade, we might have answers that seem conclusive, or we might have even more complicated questions. That's the beautiful frustration of studying human origins. Every answer reveals new mysteries. Every solution creates new puzzles to solve. But here's what we can say with confidence. Something significant happened to human populations around 900,000 years ago. Whether it was a dramatic crash, a structured dispersal, a merger of separate populations, or something we haven't even thought of yet, it left an indelible mark on our DNA. And whatever it was, our ancestors survived it, adapted to it, emerged from it changed. And that survival, however it happened, made us who we are today. Around 813,000 years ago, after 117,000 years of living on the edge of oblivion, something remarkable happened. the world began to heal. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A few extra inches of rainfall in regions that had been dust bowls for millennia. Slightly cooler summers that didn't scorch every living thing. Winters that brought enough moisture for grasslands to tentatively push through cracked earth. For those 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across their African refuges, these changes would have been subtle. Maybe an elder noticed that a particular valley, barren for their entire lifetime, now supported a few struggling acacia trees. Maybe hunters tracking scarce game found herds slightly larger than they'd been the year before. Maybe women gathering wild plants discovered new patches of edible roots in areas that had been completely dead. These weren't miracles. They were the first whispers of climate stabilization after nearly 120,000 years of environmental hell. But here's what made this moment different from all the false hopes that must have come before. Those 1,280 survivors weren't the same people who had entered the bottleneck. They were the products of the most intense natural selection event in human history. Every single one of them carried genes that had been tested by over 100,000 years of the worst conditions imaginable. Genes for intelligence sharp enough to find food where none seemed to exist. Genes for cooperation strong enough to hold communities together when resources were desperately scarce. Genes for adaptability flexible enough to survive in environments that kept changing faster than any species should be able to handle. When the climate began to improve, these people were ready in ways their ancestors could never have been. The recovery didn't happen overnight. For the first few thousand years, population growth was probably modest. Small groups that had been hovering at 20 or 30 individuals might have grown to 40 or 50. Territories that had supported only 1 or 2 family groups might have been able to sustain 3 or 4. But this was already revolutionary. For 117,000 years, the human population had essentially flatlined, caught in a desperate equilibrium where deaths matched births and survival was the only achievement. Now, for the first time in thousands of generations, there were more births than deaths. Not every year, not in every group, but often enough that the overall population trend finally pointed upward, instead of hovering just above extinction. The archaeological record from this period shows something fascinating. Stone tool technologies begin to diversify and spread across much wider geographic ranges. Before the recovery, different human groups had probably been too isolated to share innovations effectively. But as populations grew and territories expanded, contact between groups became more frequent. A clever tool design developed in one valley could spread to neighboring regions within a few generations. Knowledge was flowing again, not just accumulating in isolated pockets. By around 800,000 years ago, the human population had probably reached tens of thousands. This might not sound impressive compared to modern numbers, but it represented an explosion of life compared to the bottleneck. And these weren't just any humans anymore. These were people who carried technological innovations that had been refined by desperation. Better hunting techniques developed when game was scarce. More efficient food processing methods invented when every calorie mattered. Enhanced fire management skills created when fuel was precious and warmth meant survival. They also carried something else. Something harder to see in the fossil record, but just as important. Social technologies, ways of organizing communities, sharing resources, and maintaining cooperation that had been absolutely necessary during the crisis and now provided enormous advantages during the recovery. Think about what it takes to survive when your entire breeding population is spread across hundreds of miles in groups of 20 or 30 people. You need kinship networks strong enough that groups separated by weeks of travel still recognize each other as family. You need trade relationships reliable enough that groups will share food during lean times, trusting that the favor will be returned when circumstances reverse. You need information networks sophisticated enough that discoveries about water sources, game movements, or edible plants can spread across vast distances. The survivors had developed all of this. They had to. Groups that couldn't maintain these connections had gone extinct during the bottleneck, their genetic lines ending in isolated pockets that faced one too many droughts or one too many harsh winters without support. As the climate continued to improve, these social networks became engines of expansion. Groups that grew too large to sustain themselves in one territory didn't collapse back to smaller sizes. Instead, they split, with younger members migrating to nearby regions while maintaining ties to their parent groups. This created something biologists call a structured expansion pattern. Not just random wandering into new territories, but systematic colonization supported by networks of related communities. The genetic evidence shows this clearly. When researchers analyze the DNA of modern human populations, they can see signatures of this structured expansion. We don't just descend from those 1,280 survivors. We descend from them in patterns that reflect how their populations grew and spread. Family groups splitting and migrating but remaining connected. Regional populations developing slight genetic differences, but still exchanging members often enough to maintain overall unity. By 750,000 years ago, humans had probably recolonized most of Africa. Groups were living in environments that their ancestors had abandoned during the worst of the climate crisis. Savannas that had been uninhabitable deserts, river valleys that had been dry gullies, forests that had contracted to tiny refuges and were now expanding again across thousands of square miles, and everywhere they went they brought their survival toolkit, the technologies, the social structures, the genetic adaptations selected for during 117,000 years of near extinction. They weren't just filling empty spaces. They were transforming them, adapting them, making them more suitable for human habitation in ways that previous human species hadn't managed. The population growth accelerated. Tens of thousands became hundreds of thousands. Better nutrition from recovering ecosystems meant healthier children, more of whom survived to adulthood. More surviving children meant larger communities. Larger communities meant more successful hunts, more hands for gathering, more knowledge to share. This created what scientists call a positive feedback loop. Success breeding more success, growth enabling more growth. But the really explosive expansion was yet to come. Around 600,000 to 500,000 years ago, something unprecedented happened. The descendants of the bottleneck survivors began splitting into distinct populations that would eventually become separate species. Modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, all emerging from that single population of climate-tested survivors. This wasn't extinction. This was radiation. One species exploding into three, each adapted to different environments and challenges, all carrying the genetic signature of the bottleneck, the fused chromosome, the reduced genetic diversity, the neural adaptations that had made survival possible. Some populations pushed north and west, eventually colonizing Europe and adapting to Ice Age conditions. They became the Neanderthals, robust and powerful, perfectly suited to hunting massive Ice Age mammals in brutally cold climates. Others moved east across Asia, spreading from the Middle East to Indonesia. They became the Denisovans, mysterious and successful, leaving their genetic mark across populations from Siberia to the Pacific Islands. And some stayed in Africa, continuing to evolve in the cradle of human origins. They faced a different challenge: continued climate variability that favored not physical robustness, but mental flexibility. The ability to innovate quickly when conditions changed, to develop new technologies in response to new problems, to think symbolically, abstractly, creatively. These were our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens, and by about 300,000 years ago, we had emerged as a distinct species, carrying all the survival advantages selected for during the bottleneck and adding our own unique adaptations on top. But here's what's truly remarkable. All three human species, despite diverging into separate evolutionary paths, remained connected through their common bottleneck ancestry. When modern humans finally left Africa around 60,000 years ago, we encountered Neanderthals in the Middle East and Europe. We met Denisovans in Asia, and we didn't just compete with them, we interbred with them. The genetic evidence is undeniable. Modern humans outside Africa carry 1–2% Neanderthal DNA. Some Asian populations carry significant Denisovan ancestry. Pacific Islanders carry both. We are all hybrids, all products of multiple interbreeding events between species that have been separated for hundreds of thousands of years, but remained similar enough, connected enough through our shared bottleneck heritage to produce fertile offspring. This tells us something profound about that population of 1,280 survivors. They weren't just the ancestors of modern humans. They were the ancestors of all human diversity for the next 800,000 years. Every innovation, every adaptation, every survival strategy developed by Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans, all of it emerged from that tiny population that refused to give up during 117,000 years of climate hell. By the time modern humans began their final expansion out of Africa 60,000 years ago, we had inherited an incredible legacy. The intelligence refined during the bottleneck, the cooperation selected for when community survival was everything, the adaptability necessary to thrive in environments that kept changing, plus the additional innovations developed by hundreds of thousands of years of continued evolution. We swept across the planet. Within 50,000 years, modern humans had colonized every continent except Antarctica. We adapted to tropical rainforests and Arctic tundra, scorching deserts and misty mountain highlands. We crossed oceans, climbed the highest mountains, penetrated the deepest forests. Nothing stopped us. The population numbers tell the story. Around 60,000 years ago, when the final out-of-Africa migration began, there might have been 10,000 modern humans total. By 10,000 years ago, when agriculture was being invented, we numbered in the millions. By 2,000 years ago, perhaps 300 million. Today, 8 billion. From 1,280 to 8 billion. From the edge of extinction to planetary dominance, every single person alive today, regardless of where they live or what they look like, carries genes that survived that bottleneck 900,000 years ago. Genes selected by the most intense natural selection event in our species' history. Genes that encoded not just survival, but the capacity to thrive, to innovate, to overcome any obstacle. We are all descendants of the survivors, all products of that desperate 117,000-year struggle. All evidence that sometimes when everything goes catastrophically wrong, a small group of determined individuals can be tough enough, smart enough, and cooperative enough to not just endure, but to eventually flourish beyond anything imaginable. But this raises a final, haunting question. If we came so close to extinction once, could it happen again? So here's where this ancient story stops being just about the past and starts being about right now, about you, about me, about every single person watching this. Because that near-extinction event 900,000 years ago, it's not just some fascinating piece of evolutionary trivia. It's a warning, a guidebook, and maybe, just maybe, a reason for hope all wrapped into one terrifying package. Let's start with the uncomfortable part. The parallels between what happened to our ancestors and what's happening right now are absolutely chilling. 900,000 years ago, Earth's climate went haywire. Temperatures plunged. Rainfall patterns collapsed. Ecosystems that had been stable for hundreds of thousands of years disintegrated in what was probably just a few generations. Our ancestors watched their world become unlivable and had no idea why it was happening or when it would stop. Sound familiar? We're living through the most rapid climate change in at least 10,000 years. Global temperatures rising faster than any natural variation on record. Rainfall patterns shifting in ways that turn farmland into desert and stable regions into flood zones. Ecosystems collapsing at rates that scientists describe using words like catastrophic and unprecedented. The difference is we know exactly why it's happening, we're doing it, and we know it's going to get worse before it gets better. But here's what the bottleneck teaches us about climate catastrophe. It's not the gradual change that nearly killed us. Humans are actually pretty good at adapting to slow environmental shifts. What nearly wiped us out was the speed and severity of the collapse, the way stable systems failed all at once, the compounding effects that turned bad situations into extinction-level threats. That's what keeps climate scientists awake at night. Not the 2-degree temperature increase by itself, but what happens when that triggers feedback loops. When melting permafrost releases methane, which accelerates warming, which melts more permafrost. When changing ocean currents shift weather patterns, which causes crop failures, which triggers migrations, which creates conflicts, which destabilize regions, which compounds every other problem. Our ancestors faced this kind of cascading collapse. They survived. Barely. With massive population loss, the disappearance of entire lineages, and 117,000 years of desperate struggle. We have advantages they didn't. Technology, global communication, scientific understanding of what's happening and why, the ability to act collectively if we choose to. But we also have vulnerabilities they never imagined. Think about those 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across Africa. They were spread out, remember? Small groups separated by hundreds of miles. That saved them. When disaster struck one region, other groups survived to carry on. Now look at modern humanity. 8 billion people, but more concentrated than ever before. Over half the human population lives in urban areas, cities of 10, 20, 30 million people, dependent on supply chains that span thousands of miles. Break those supply chains, and millions starve within weeks, not generations. Your ancestors could survive on what they could hunt, gather, and carry. Could you? Could anyone you know? We've gained incredible technological sophistication, but lost the basic survival skills that carried our species through 117,000 years of near extinction. That's not an argument against technology or civilization. It's a recognition of vulnerability. Those scattered hunter-gatherer groups had resilience through diversity and independence. We have efficiency through specialization and interdependence. Efficiency is great until the system breaks. Then independence looks pretty attractive, but the bottleneck teaches us something else too. Something about genetic diversity that should terrify anyone paying attention to modern conservation biology. Remember how the population crash destroyed 98.7% of human genetic variation? That loss left permanent scars in our DNA, reduced disease resistance, higher rates of genetic disorders, less flexibility to adapt to environmental changes. We're doing the same thing to countless other species right now. Habitat destruction, climate change, and hunting are creating population bottlenecks across the entire tree of life. Species that once numbered in the millions are now down to thousands, hundreds, sometimes dozens of breeding individuals. Every time a population crashes below a certain threshold, it loses genetic diversity permanently. Even if the population recovers, that diversity never comes back. It's gone forever. Look at cheetahs. They went through a population bottleneck sometime in the last 10,000 years. Now all cheetahs are so genetically similar that they can accept skin grafts from unrelated individuals without rejection. They're essentially one giant family. This makes them vulnerable to diseases that could wipe out the entire species. One really bad virus and cheetahs go extinct. We did this to ourselves 900,000 years ago. Natural forces created a bottleneck that nearly destroyed us. Now we're creating bottlenecks for everything else. Elephants, rhinos, tigers, polar bears, countless species of fish, birds, amphibians. We're reducing their genetic diversity, making them vulnerable to the same kinds of existential threats that nearly ended humanity. The difference is they don't have 117,000 years to recover. They might not have 117 more years. But here's where it gets really interesting, where the ancient crisis teaches us something unexpected about human nature itself. Those bottleneck survivors, they weren't superhuman. They didn't have special abilities or divine protection. They were just people, facing impossible odds, refusing to give up. They survived through cooperation, through knowledge sharing, through social bonds that held communities together even when death seemed certain. The genetic and archaeological evidence shows that the groups which made it through the bottleneck weren't necessarily the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones who worked together, who took care of their sick and elderly, who shared resources even when resources were scarce. Compassion wasn't a luxury for our ancestors. It was a survival strategy. Communities that looked after vulnerable members, that pooled knowledge and resources, that maintained social bonds across multiple generations, those were the communities that survived. These selfish groups, the ones that abandoned the weak or hoarded resources, they went extinct. This rewrote human evolution. Natural selection during the bottleneck favored cooperation, empathy, social intelligence. The people who survived weren't rugged individualists, they were community builders. That's in our DNA now. Literally. The capacity for complex cooperation, for empathy, for abstract reasoning about fairness and justice. These traits were refined during 117,000 years of near extinction. They're not weaknesses, they're survival mechanisms, which brings us to the contemporary challenges we're facing. Climate change, yes, but also pandemics, resource scarcity, political instability, the existential risks of technologies we're developing faster than we can understand them. The COVID-19 pandemic gave us a tiny glimpse of what our ancestors endured. A few years of disruption, millions dead, supply chains broken, societies stressed to their limits. That was nothing compared to 117,000 years of crisis. But look at how we responded. Global scientific collaboration produced vaccines in record time. Communities organized to protect vulnerable members. Healthcare workers risked their lives to save strangers. Imperfect, chaotic, but fundamentally cooperative. That's the bottleneck speaking through us. The inherited wisdom of ancestors who learned that cooperation beats competition when survival is on the line. But the pandemic also revealed our weaknesses. Misinformation spreading faster than facts. Political divisions undermining collective action. Resource hoarding when sharing would have saved more lives. The same social media technologies that could coordinate global cooperation were used to spread conspiracy theories and deepen tribalism. Our ancestors didn't have to deal with that. Their information networks were face-to-face, slow but reliable. Lies didn't spread at the speed of light. Bad actors couldn't manipulate millions with algorithmic precision. We've created technologies that amplify both our best and worst traits. The same global connectivity that lets scientists collaborate across continents also lets demagogues coordinate hate across time zones. The same industrial systems that feed billions also pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at rates that would have seemed impossible a century ago. The bottleneck teaches us that these are choices. Evolution didn't make our ancestors cooperative by accident. It selected for cooperation because cooperation worked. The groups that figured out how to work together survived. The ones that didn't disappeared. We have the same choice now, just at a much larger scale. We can use our technologies to coordinate global cooperation, to share resources and knowledge, to solve collective problems collectively. Or we can use them to amplify division, to compete for dwindling resources, to maximize short-term gains while ignoring long-term consequences. Our ancestors didn't have the luxury of that choice. Cooperation wasn't optional, it was survive together or die alone. Maybe we need to remember that. But here's the hopeful part, the part that makes this whole, terrifying story worth telling. 1,280 people. That's how many breeding individuals survived the worst environmental catastrophe in human history. 1,280 people who refused to give up when everything suggested giving up was the only rational choice. Their descendants went on to populate the entire planet, to develop agriculture, build cities, create art and music and literature, to split the atom and walk on the moon, to sequence their own genome and discover the very bottleneck that nearly ended them before they began. Every human achievement, every work of art, every scientific discovery, every act of courage and compassion and creativity, all of it came from the descendants of those 1,280 survivors. We are those descendants. You, me, every person alive today carries genes that survived 117,000 years of near extinction. We are literally made of survivors, forged by the worst our planet could throw at early humans and still standing. If 1,280 people could survive that, could hold on through 117,000 years of hell, and not just survive but emerge stronger, smarter, more capable than before, what can 8 billion achieve? We have resources our ancestors couldn't have dreamed of. Knowledge, technology, the ability to communicate and coordinate across the entire planet. We understand the challenges we're facing in ways they never could have understood theirs. We're not helpless. We're not doomed. We're the descendants of the most resilient, adaptable, stubbornly persistent species in Earth's history. Our ancestors survived the unsurvivable. Multiple times. The bottleneck wasn't even the only near-extinction event in human history. It was just the worst one we have clear genetic evidence for. Every time extinction seemed certain, humanity found a way through. Not through luck. Through intelligence, cooperation, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit. That's our inheritance. That's what the bottleneck teaches us. The challenges we face are real. Climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemic risks, technological dangers. These aren't exaggerations or fear-mongering. They're genuine existential threats. But existential threats are kind of our specialty. We've been dealing with them since before we were fully human, and we're still here. The question isn't whether we can survive what's coming. Our ancestors proved we can survive damn near anything. The question is what we'll become in the process. Whether we'll cooperate or compete. Whether we'll use our inherited intelligence and social abilities to solve collective problems or squander them on short-term advantages. Whether we'll be worthy descendants of those 1,280 survivors who refused to let humanity end. 900,000 years ago, a few thousand people faced the impossible and won. Their prize was us, all of us. Everything we've built, everything we've achieved, everything we might still become. Now it's our turn. We face different threats, but we're armed with their genes, their adaptations, their hard-won survival strategies written into our very DNA. The bottleneck survivors didn't know if they'd make it. They just kept going anyway. Maybe that's the most important lesson of all. So here we are, at the end of an incredible journey through time. We started with a genetic puzzle, a signature written in every human genome that whispered a terrifying secret. 900,000 years ago, our ancestors nearly vanished. Not gradually, not peacefully, but in a catastrophic collapse that reduced the entire human population to maybe 1,280 breeding individuals. For 117,000 years, roughly 4,600 generations, humanity clung to existence by its fingernails. We explored the theories, the climate catastrophe that transformed Africa into a desert wasteland, the possible supervolcano that might have delivered the first blow, filling skies with ash and plunging the world into nuclear winter. We imagined what survival looked like. Small groups scattered across the last habitable refuges, connected by threads of kinship and trade, playing a desperate game of whack-a-mole with extinction. We saw how this crucible transformed us, how 117,000 years of the most intense natural selection imaginable forged the cognitive abilities, the social cooperation, the sheer stubborn resilience that defines humanity. We traced the recovery, the explosive expansion, the splitting into 3 human species, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals and Denisovans, all carrying the genetic scars of near extinction, all descendants of the same tiny group of survivors. But here's the thing, we still don't know the whole story. Despite decades of research, despite genetic breakthroughs and archaeological discoveries, despite computer models and climate reconstructions, the population crash of 900,000 years ago remains partially shrouded in mystery. We know it happened. The genetic evidence is unambiguous, but the exact cause, the precise locations where survivors held out, the specific adaptations that let them endure, these questions are still being debated in laboratories and field sites around the world. Some researchers are convinced the answer lies in climate data, searching ancient lake beds and ocean sediments for evidence of the exact temperature shifts and rainfall patterns that would have created the crisis. Others are looking for geological evidence of volcanic eruptions, analysing ash layers and sulfur deposits that might pinpoint the catastrophe. Still others are focusing on the genetic data itself, using increasingly sophisticated algorithms to extract more information from the chromosomal fusion and diversity patterns that first revealed the bottleneck. New technologies are opening new possibilities. Ancient DNA analysis is getting better every year. We can now extract usable genetic material from fossils hundreds of thousands of years old. Within our lifetimes, we might actually recover DNA from individuals who lived during the bottleneck itself. Imagine that. Imagine reading the actual genome of someone who survived those 117,000 years, seeing exactly what genetic variants helped them endure, understanding precisely how natural selection was operating in real time. Archaeological techniques are advancing too. New dating methods, better preservation technologies, more sophisticated analysis of stone tools and settlement patterns. Every year brings discoveries that refine our understanding of where humans were living, how they were surviving, what technologies they were developing. The next breakthrough could come from anywhere. A cave site in Africa that preserves evidence of bottleneck-era occupation. A volcanic eruption date that matches the genetic timeline perfectly. A climate reconstruction that finally explains why the crisis lasted so long and ended so abruptly. But while we wait for those discoveries, we already know the most important part of the story. You exist. Every person watching this video, everyone who will ever watch it, everyone who has ever lived or will ever live, we're all here because a few thousand desperate humans refused to give up, because they found ways to survive when survival seemed impossible, because they adapted, innovated, cooperated, and persevered through the worst environmental catastrophe in human history. You carry their genes selected for intelligence, for cooperation, for the ability to solve problems under extreme pressure, genes that help them process new foods, resist new diseases, adapt to new climates, genes that gave them the cognitive capacity to develop language, culture, technology, the mental toolkit that would eventually let humans dominate an entire planet. When you solve a difficult problem, when you work with others to overcome a challenge, when you adapt to change and find ways to survive unexpected difficulties, you're using abilities that were forged 900,000 years ago in the crucible of near extinction. You're living proof that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, a few individuals can be tough enough, smart enough, stubborn enough to keep hope alive until the world becomes livable again. Which raises one final question. We survived the crisis of 900,000 years ago because our ancestors were adaptable, cooperative, and resilient. Today, we face our own environmental challenges, our own potential catastrophes. Climate change, habitat destruction, resource depletion. Do we still have what it takes? Are we still the descendants of survivors, or have we forgotten the lessons written in our genes? If you found this story as fascinating as I do, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into human history and evolution. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far across the planet the descendants of those 1,280 survivors have spread. The mystery continues, and maybe, just maybe, you'll be alive when we finally solve it.